employee loyalty is dead. That's what I keep hearing from different business owners is people just don't commit to companies like they used to. Well, maybe the issue isn't employees. Maybe the issue is how people are leading businesses and what they don't understand about employees today. We're going to get into it today on the podcast. Hello, I'm your host, Blake Benz of the Good Advice Podcast, and this is the place to learn how to do business the right way with actionable, practical tips, no fluff, just good advice. And before we dive into today's show, first of all, welcome to the show. And second of all, we got a quick ad from a business that supports and sponsors the podcast. Don't forget, you can always check out more about the podcast on our Patreon, patreon.com/goodadvice. Or if you're a business, you want to advertise on the show, you can always reach out, Blake at goodadvicecoaching.com. Let's get into this story today with the Mavs and Luka Doncic on the show. We'll get right back to it in a second. There's one single piece of advice that I give to business owners who are ready to scale their business drastically. And that's knowing exactly what you need to hand off so that you can continue focusing on what you're an expert in. It amazes me when I talk to business owners who are doing their own bookkeeping and tax prep, and worse, that they're going through all this paperwork at 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock, even midnight, slaving away trying to make sense of all of the numbers for their business. Business owners who are making it happen have already figured out that you can't do it all yourself. That's why I recommend Steve Lay with Equity Business Solutions. Not only is he an expert in bookkeeping and tax prep, but what I love about Steve is that he'll sit down with you and help you make sense of the value of your business beyond just reading a spreadsheet. You'll be able to make better decisions, and more importantly, you're going to save yourself the crucial time you would have spent going through QuickBooks or an Excel spreadsheet or whatever it is that keeps us up late at night. So save yourself some time and some money by giving Steve Lay a call at Equity Business Solutions, and he'll show you the value beyond your numbers. Go to equitybusinesssolutionsllc.com to find out more. So I want to talk today about probably not just the biggest trade of the season, but maybe the biggest trade in the history of the NBA, only because of the drama around this trade. So if you're not an NBA player, if you're not an NBA fan, I'll give you a little bit of the gist of it. Luka Doncic, who is the star player for the Mavs, was traded this past weekend. Late at night, the news broke that he was being traded from the Mavs, from the Dallas Mavericks, to the LA Lakers. Now, players get traded all the time. So what's the big deal? Well, the big deal is that, and I'll get more into this in a second, but he was effectively traded for what looked like a pretty one-way trade. I'm not going to get into, throwing criticism at the player who's coming over to the Mavs. But what I will say is, looking at the deal on paper, it was very confusing. It was not what looked like an equitable trade. And more importantly, Luka is the star player of the Mavs franchise. Not just the star player, but is the heart and soul of the team. He is one of the best players in the league, one of the best players that certainly the Mavs have had in a long time. And there have just been a lot of eyebrows raised about this deal, not to mention the fact that Luka wasn't part of the conversation for the deal. He wasn't asked about it. No one, there was no conversation on, do you even want to be traded? Because if he had been asked, he would have said, no, I don't want to be traded. I'm committed to the Mavs franchise, the Mavs team. So getting more into this, let's read just a couple of just details about Luka, other than the fact that he's a great player, an all-star player, what have you. This guy scored 70 points in a single game. He had a 60-point triple-double. He averages 34, 9, and 10. That's points, assists, and rebounds, which is an incredible stat line for a player. He's 25 years old. He's a 5-time All-NBA first-team player. They just made it to the finals last year, by the way, which coaches have been fired for way less. But his team just made it to the finals last year, led the league in scoring. He finished in, I think, second or maybe third in the MVP voting of who the most valuable player in the entirety of the league is. This guy is insane. He's incredibly good, incredibly gifted. Mark Cuban, who used to own the Mavs before he sold his majority stake, Mark Cuban once joked that if he had to choose between keeping Luka on the Mavs and divorcing his wife, that he would sooner see himself at his lawyer's office than see Luka go from the team. So you look at this and you ask yourself, like, what changed? What happened? Well, looking more into the information around the trade, we see that the general manager, Nico Harrison, apparently had a friendship with the general manager with the Lakers, and they were shooting the breeze, spending time together, hanging out, what have you. The way this whole thing was described is very casual, very like, yeah, we began, spending time together and being like, well, what if we could make this trade happen? What would happen? Oh no, we could. Well, what if we did do it? The whole story is very weird and confusing, and like, you guys were like having cigars and just were like, hey, what if? What if we traded away Luka? It doesn't really make a lot of sense, but point being, it's incredibly devastating. It's devastating to be a Mavs fan. It's devastating to be a Luka fan. I have to imagine that Luka himself is probably extremely devastated about the news, knowing that he was committed to the franchise for as long as he has been, and where he sees himself going in the future. And if you don't follow the NBA, a little bit more about this. This is a sport where people change teams often. I remember being totally crushed when Kevin Durant left the Oklahoma City Thunder to go form the super team with the Golden State Warriors. And I remember this happening right after they barely lost to Golden State in the semifinals. So that kind of action isn't uncommon. If you've watched long term, you probably remember LeBron James leaving the Cavs to go play for the Miami Heat with, I think it was Dwayne Wade and Chris Bosh. It's just a sport where super teams are common. Where people, these all stars will request to trade to go play with other all stars because it's all about getting the championship ring. So when a player doesn't do that and they insist on playing for their team, it is something truly rare and truly special. I talk about this story today because in the business world, I hear often that loyalty is simply not appreciated anymore, that employees don't value loyalty. And frankly, this is something that was talked about a lot with my fellow millennials. It's talked about a lot with Gen Zers today. We always love taking the latest generation and just ripping on them rather than looking in a mirror. But conversations around people will just swap jobs at the drop of a hat, and all this mistrust. And, I'm going to be really hesitant to invest in an employee because they might leave. All these things like looking at resumes and the hiring process and even counting how many jobs someone has had in the last 10 years, which, by the way, is kind of a wild thing, knowing today that we live in a gig economy and it's not uncommon for someone to have a multitude of jobs. A little hiring tip, by the way, if you are applying for jobs, is to only put the jobs that are relevant on the resume. Otherwise, you might do yourself a disservice by someone thinking that maybe you job hop. And I've even seen this with one of my a friend of mine who was even in like a really miserable job in the banking world. And I said, well, why don't you quit? And he was like, well, because I can't quit. Because if I do, then the next bank that I go to, they're going to want to know, why did I leave this one? And why was I only there for a year? Even though he was miserable. That is today's work culture, unfortunately. I don't think it's right. If it was me, I would quit regardless. It just is what it is. But employers today complain at length about how people aren't loyal enough. They don't stick it out. They're not committed to the company. And I got to say, this uh, I think I think business owners have a hard time being honest with themselves and truly understanding today's work culture. The healthiest way that you can approach employment for your business, people who are going to work for you, is understanding that when someone comes to work for you, they don't inherently owe you something because they work for you. You are forming a partnership with this person, not a formal partnership, obviously, but you are forming an agreement with this person that says you are going to work X amount of hours doing this certain task. And in exchange, I'm going to pay you Y amount of dollars. That's the arrangement we're forming. Everything else beyond this is something that you've cooked up as a business owner. It's something that was never, it isn't what you maybe think it is. And I mentioned that because I've heard business owners commiserate around employees. I've done a lot of team events over the years. I've done a lot of work directly with business owners around their teams. And I've heard almost all of it, especially comments like they should be grateful they have a job. They should be grateful to us for giving them a job. It's thanks to us that they have a roof over their head. It's thanks to us that, and so on and so forth, where suddenly employment becomes this weird sense of ego stroking of like, somehow I'm building a claim because I hire people. Excuse me. To have a really healthy perspective on business means really understanding what it means for someone to work with you and for you. Employment is not the ultimate ego stroke. And because you hired someone, that person does not now have a life of servitude to you. That would be slavery. That'd be an indentured servant. And businesses who really don't understand this find themselves continually frustrated by their lack of talent and angry to the point where they are blaming generations constantly for why they can't seem to find momentum in the hiring world. Luka is just one example of this, by the way. There's thousands of stories like this where someone said, I'm committing to the vision, I'm committing to the company, I'm going all in, and then the company pulls the rug out from under them. And by the way, it's not just, it's not, I mean, I think the general manager for the Mavs is getting pretty heavily ripped on, and it seems like for good reason, but even well-meaning businesses, at the end of the day, they are only going to do what suits their best interests. It just is what it is. I think that is a hard truth for sometimes people to understand, in that, just because your company is a good company, and just because they've said they care about you, and by the way, none of this is pessimistic, by the way. Don't take this as pessimism. This is simply how it is. In understanding that a business at the end of the day will make the decision that best ensures, one, its survival, and two, its profitability, according to the owner or investors or stockholders or what have you. So with that, understand that a business is never then going to make a decision that's in your best interest when it directly conflicts with one of those interests for themselves. I was talking with a friend of mine the other day. He just changed jobs, and he's always worked for companies that were faith-based companies, that were Christian companies, where either it's a company that sells like in the Christian world, or it's a company where like the owners and the executive team or whatever were open, devout Christians, and their faithdom, for lack of a better phrase, was an integral part of like the values of the company. Which, if you're not from the Bible Belt, maybe you're not Christian, maybe that sounds like a weird concept, but it's actually very common, especially in the Bible Belt. So I was talking to a friend of mine, and I said, I knew he had changed jobs. So I said, "Hey, where you at now? What you doing?" And he was talking about the business he was working for now, which is not a faith-driven company. It's a very, it's a publicly traded company, and I mean, that's just is what it is. It's a publicly traded company, but not Christian at all. I said, "Hey, how's it going?" And he said, "You know what? Man, they're taking care of me." And I said, "Okay, really?" And he goes, "Not only are they taking care of me, they're taking better care of me than those Christian companies ever took care of me." And I was like, "Wow, really?" And I think part of the realization for him was realizing, oh, the Christendom of these companies to him implied a different type of relationship than what he actually got. And I think the misunderstanding there was that, yeah, it's a Christian company, but it's a business. It's a business. And that can be a hard truth to swallow. And these companies have made decisions for their best interest as a business. Again, it's not meant to be negative or cynical. And this is just how it works, right? So for you as an employee in a business, what that means is you always want to make decisions that best secure your future, whatever that may look like. And that isn't meant to sound grandiose, though it can. That may mean fighting for a promotion because you know how valuable having that promoted title will be on your resume. It may be fighting for a pay raise, understanding that no one else will. And I've told this story before, but I worked for a business that I had been, and I don't remember the exact numbers, so I'm just going to throw out some numbers, but it may not have been exactly this. At the start of the year, I had been promised a 10% pay raise at the end of the year. Well, the business went through some hard times. It went through some layoffs, and it was in a tough position, essentially. In addition to this, in the health insurance, the employee health insurance that was provided by this business also significantly went up at the end of the year. So much so that we got a message around it that basically said, "Hey, unfortunately, because of the number of claims that happened last year and the dollars and all this kind of stuff, it's all above my head. The cost of insurance is going to be increasing significantly." And that was cost to me as an employee. So all this to say, kind of the understood or what happened out of this was my boss said, "Hey, unfortunately, because times are hard, we're not going to be able to give any raises." And this was like, I think like a mass email or something like that. So, I think a lot of people would stop there. I think they would stop there and say, "Okay, yeah, the boss said, it's a hard time. It's not doable. I want to do what's right by the company." And I think this is where we get a little cross sometimes. I think sometimes we think that being considerate or kind needs to be in opposition of our own ambition and our own needs. And I think now my boss did not come to me and say, "Blake, I need you to sacrifice your own needs for the company." And I think that conversation rarely, if ever, actually happens. But I think most of us are not serial killers and weirdo crazy people. I think most of us have a kind heart and we want to do what's right and we want to be selfless. In fact, with the Berkman personality test I've done hundreds of these, maybe thousands of these at this point. There is a personality trait on incentives, and it's how people deal with incentives. And the majority of people, according to this Berkman test, they care more about the incentives of everyone on the team than they do for themselves. That's how people in general will operate, is that most people will make sure that everyone gets theirs before they say, "Hey, I want to get mine." Because we're often taught and trained as kids that to get yours is selfish, that it's wrong, that it's bad. It's bad to think about yourself. This could not be worse advice for a professional out there. So my boss had said, "Hey, there's not going to be any raises. It's a hard time, what have you." And I very easily could have just been like, "Okay, yeah, well, it's not possible." Well, I had been told that I was going to get a 10% raise. And frankly, the well-being of the company had nothing to do with me. I'm just boots on the ground. I'm just a grunt in the company. I'm not making the big decisions. So what I did was I went back to my boss and I said, "Hey, I know you said there wouldn't be any raises, but this is what was told to me. I started at a lower base than I wanted, or started the year off at a lower base than I would have liked. And I was given the understanding that that was the case because at the end of the year, I would get this pay raise. So here I am asking for the pay raise." Well, my boss came back and said, "Yeah, well, like I said, it's not possible." And I'm sure they said it in a very polite way, but they basically said, "Hey, it's not possible because of all these reasons that we already said." Well, I could have let it go, but I didn't. And I came back and I said, "Hey, I totally get that. I totally understand that." Now, knowing what I know now, I probably would have articulated this a lot better back then. But, I basically presented this essay of like, cost of insurance is going up, all this, the state of the business is irrelevant to me, and I'm like, here's my debts. I just bought a house and I'm actually making less money now because when you take into the rise of inflation and then the healthcare costs, I'm actually like making less money here, and I don't think that's a appropriate value for our employees is to reduce the pay that goes into their pocket. Or I can't remember anything I said. Well, she came back probably because I was so annoying about this and, was very kind to say, "Hey, you know what?" And I think this person actually went to bat for me. I think the person even said like, "Hey, I'm gonna talk to, my boss to see where this can go." And, that person came back and said, "Yeah, we're gonna make it happen. It's gonna happen. And it's the amount that you asked for." Again, I didn't feel like I was being selfish or greedy or what have you. But the point is that I had to make the best decision for me because I didn't know what the future of that company would look like. And I don't mean that in an ominous way, but businesses can change drastically year to year. The business that you love and are committed to can go out of business tomorrow. It can be bought by someone else next year who has totally different ambitions for your career than you do. So, keeping all of this in mind, it's healthiest instead of seeing your commitment to a company as I've drank the Kool Aid, I'm going to do everything I can to promote this business, even at my own expense. I'll be honest that I haven't heard a lot of stories where the person looks back positively on those sacrifices. I've heard a lot of stories of the alternate of I, paid blood, sweat, and tears for this business. And this is how they repaid me in a way that I really did not appreciate. So understand that it's less about loyalty and it's frankly a little bit more about integrity. And what it says is while I work here, I'm going to commit myself to the job you've paid me for. I'm going to do it to the best of my ability, and I'm going to deliver on what you've asked me to deliver on. And on the flip side, if you're an employer, I think part of that integrity is also being candid with your employees on this is what I'm hiring you to do. This is the pay that I'm offering for you to do it. And here's what me investing in you will look like over the next however many years that you're here. And I never, for me, whenever I'm hiring or managing people, I never take myself so seriously as to assume someone will work with me forever. Typically, when I have this conversation with people, I typically say, "Hey, for as long as you're with us, for as long as you choose to be with us." It's not like in an ominous way, like you could be fired tomorrow. It's for as long as you choose to be with us. This is what investment in you looks like, and that can be certain bonuses, that could be certain trainings and conferences and different programs to send you to, or skill sets to get you involved in. I had somebody who worked directly for me who really wanted to become a better public speaker. It was unrelated, it was semi related to her job. And so we paid for Toastmasters, for her to go do Toastmasters, because that was something she wanted to do. She said, "Hey, I want to do Toastmasters." I said, "Let's do it." It's a small expense to develop you. It's going to make you a little bit better at your job here, but more importantly, it's an investment that I'm willing to make in you that's only going to pay off if you stay here. But more importantly, I think it's just a good investment to make in you. So, all that to say, this story is pretty crazy about Luka. I mean, it's what happens in an endless number of businesses day after day after day. And the companies who simply don't understand this concept, they're the ones usually screaming the loudest about the problems with certain, like I said, Gen Zers or millennials or what have you, but generically shouting the loudest about there's no loyalty anymore. There's people who just want to get their own, who want to just advance their own careers and what have you. Companies who have the right perspective on this, I think, tend to retain talent better long term because there's a healthier perspective on what good employment looks like, what a healthy relationship actually looks like. Anyone who works for me, I never want them to drink the Kool-Aid for my brand, just because it's. I guess I just don't take myself that seriously, but I just always encourage people to look after themselves and watch after themselves. So it's a good rule set to live by. Remember, the way I've heard it described to me is years from now, the only person who will remember that you worked late nights and long hours won't be that random boss you had. The only person who will remember it, or the only people who will remember it, are your kids and your family. Something to think about. So take care of yourself. And if you are an employer, take care of your people and be candid and direct as to what this relationship looks like. And let's stop, guilting people into indentured servitude for your business and these weird relationships where, you make them memorize and recite the cheer on their first day on the job. That might be a cult. I don't know. It's something to think about. So anyway, hey, thanks so much for listening to the podcast today. I so appreciate you. What do you think about the Luka news? You can drop me a line on LinkedIn or at my email, blake@goodadvicecoaching.com. If you enjoyed this episode, you can always check out our Patreon to support the podcast. For $5 a month, you can support the podcast. And then we also have a bunch of just free supporters. I didn't even realize this was a thing until I looked the other day and was like, oh, wow, we have a lot of free people who are supporting the podcast. So I'll take that as just like a thumbs up from you. Of like, I like it enough to sign up to the Patreon, which I appreciate and I thank you for. But all that to say, thanks so much for listening to today's podcast episode. That's today's good advice. We'll see you later.